Where law was weak and danger ruled, Wild West prisons became hell on earth, places where few survived and justice was a deadly gamble. In the early days of the Wild West, prisons were far from the secure, organized facilities we know today. They were often hastily constructed structures built from whatever materials were available: wooden planks, scrap metal, or even mud bricks. Many frontier towns didn't even have a dedicated jail when they were first founded. Instead, they used makeshift holding cells such as abandoned barns, saloons' backrooms, or dugout holes in the ground. Security was minimal. Most of these early jails lacked proper locks, reinforced doors, or even solid walls. Cells were often nothing more than wooden rooms with barred windows and a single door that could be broken down with a strong kick. Some prisoners were chained to posts, wagon wheels, or even trees to prevent escape. In particularly lawless areas, suspects might be kept in open-air cages or iron-barred wagons until a judge could be found, if one existed at all. Since these towns were built rapidly in response to gold rushes, cattle drives, or railroad expansions, the focus was always on profit and survival, not justice or infrastructure. Law enforcement was severely underfunded, and jails were usually a last-minute thought. The result was a chaotic system where dangerous criminals could easily escape, innocent people could be held without evidence, and mob justice often replaced legal procedures. Life inside a Wild West prison was brutal and unforgiving. The conditions were not only inhumane, but often deadly. With little to no government oversight and limited resources, prisoners were crammed into small, dark, and poorly ventilated spaces. In many cases, there were no individual cells, just open rooms or holding pens where men, women, and even children were forced to sleep side by side on dirt floors or rotting straw mats. Sanitation was nearly non-existent. Most jails had no plumbing, and inmates were left to relieve themselves in buckets that were rarely emptied, leading to the rapid spread of disease. Rats, lice, and fleas thrived in these filthy environments, and illnesses like tuberculosis, dysentery, and pneumonia spread unchecked. Clean water was scarce, and food was often just moldy bread, beans, or salted meat, barely enough to sustain life, let alone health. Extreme weather made the suffering worse. During the scorching summers of places like Arizona or New Mexico, the small, enclosed jail cells became ovens, suffocating inmates with unbearable heat. In the freezing winters of Wyoming or Montana, prisoners were left shivering under thin blankets, with no insulation and often no fire for warmth. Medical care was virtually non-existent. If someone got sick or injured, they were expected to endure it or die. There were no trained doctors assigned to these prisons, and jailers, often untrained themselves, were more concerned with keeping order than with anyone's well-being. For many, being sentenced to prison in the Wild West was not just a loss of freedom. It was a slow march toward death in a place where human life was treated as expendable. In the Wild West, formal legal systems were often non-existent or too weak to handle the rapid rise in crime. As settlements grew faster than governments could establish order, citizens frequently took the law into their own hands. This gave rise to a culture of vigilante justice, where mobs and self-appointed lawmen enforced their own idea of right and wrong, sometimes with deadly consequences. Sheriffs and marshals were few and far between, especially in isolated towns or mining camps. Even when they were present, they were often underpaid, poorly trained, and overwhelmed by the scale of lawlessness. With no proper courts, judges, or legal procedures in place, justice became a matter of community opinion and popular emotion rather than facts or fairness. Accusations could lead to immediate punishment without any investigation. If someone was suspected of theft, murder, or even just behaving suspiciously, they could be dragged into the streets and subjected to a people's trial, which was often nothing more than a public spectacle. In many cases, these gatherings ended with hangings from trees, makeshift gallows, or even telegraph poles. No questions asked, no defense allowed. Lynching became a terrifyingly common method of delivering justice. Entire communities would gather to watch, treating it like entertainment. The mob mentality fed off fear and anger, and many innocent people were caught in its fury, especially marginalized individuals such as Native Americans, African Americans, immigrants, or outsiders who didn't fit in. Prisons, when they existed, were sometimes bypassed altogether. A suspect might be locked up for a few hours only to be broken out by an angry mob determined to deliver their own version of punishment. In some regions, vigilante groups even gave themselves official-sounding names and operated like shadow governments, controlling towns with threats and violence in the name of justice. While many Wild West towns relied on makeshift jails or improvised holding cells, a few prisons stood out for their notoriety, size, and sheer brutality. Among them, the Yuma Territorial Prison in Arizona and the Wyoming Frontier Prison in Rawlins became infamous not only for the dangerous criminals they housed, but also for the conditions that made survival inside them a test of endurance. Yuma Territorial Prison, opened in 1876, was carved into the unforgiving desert along the Colorado River. Built by prisoners themselves, the facility had thick stone walls and iron-barred cells that trapped heat like an oven. Summers turned the interior into a furnace, with temperatures soaring past 110 degrees Fahrenheit 43 degrees Celsius. Inmates were crammed into small cells, given minimal food, and subjected to hard labor in the scorching sun. The prison had a dark cell, a windowless solitary confinement room used to punish those who disobeyed. Prisoners were chained in pitch-black isolation for days or weeks, often emerging broken mentally and physically. Wyoming Frontier Prison, opened in 1901, symbolized a shift toward a more structured, but no less harsh, form of incarceration. Known for its massive stone walls and cold, isolated cells, this prison housed murderers, outlaws, and horse thieves alike. Executions were carried out by a traveling gallows and later a gas chamber, making the facility infamous for its methods of capital punishment. Brutal discipline, overcrowding, and near-freezing winter conditions made life inside the prison a daily struggle. These prisons became legends of their own. Stories of daring escapes, cruel wardens, and ghostly hauntings turned them into symbols of both law and savagery. They represented the struggle of a young nation trying to tame its wild frontiers, not just with guns, but with cages. Unlike modern penitentiaries designed for reform, these early prisons prioritized punishment, deterrence, and control over rehabilitation. The expansion of the American frontier in the 19th century was explosive and chaotic. Fueled by gold rushes, cattle drives, and the relentless push of the railroad, towns sprang up almost overnight across the vast western landscape. What started as simple mining camps or rail stops quickly ballooned into bustling communities filled with fortune seekers, traders, gamblers, and outlaws. With this sudden growth came an inevitable surge in crime, and the towns were utterly unprepared to handle it. Law enforcement infrastructure was often an afterthought. In many of these boom towns, there were no trained police, no courthouses, and no established jails. Elected sheriffs or marshals, if they existed at all, were usually overwhelmed. They had limited authority, few deputies, and no real support system. Criminals quickly realized that the frontier offered easy opportunities to exploit chaos, commit robberies or murders, and disappear into the wilderness before anyone could pursue them. As saloons, brothels, and gambling halls filled the streets, so did trouble. Drunken brawls, gunfights, and theft became daily occurrences. Many settlers carried weapons, and disputes were often settled with bullets rather than words. The traditional legal system couldn't keep up, and makeshift forms of justice, like hastily built jails, citizen patrols, or vigilante committees, became the norm. Even when jailhouses were built, they were often too small or poorly constructed to contain the rising tide of criminals. Some towns had only 1 or 2 cells, with prisoners chained to walls or shackled together for lack of better options. In extreme cases, overflowing jails meant that some suspects were released early, or handed over to angry mobs demanding immediate justice. The rapid and unplanned growth of these towns created a volatile environment where the line between lawman and outlaw often blurred. Many sheriffs were former criminals themselves, hired for their toughness rather than their integrity. The booming populations and economic opportunities of the Wild West brought prosperity for some, but also created a dangerous vacuum where crime thrived and justice lagged far behind. The prisons of the Wild West were a melting pot of humanity's darkest and most desperate figures, reflecting the turbulent and often unjust nature of frontier life. Unlike modern prisons where inmates might be categorized and separated based on crime, gender, or other factors, Wild West jails were chaotic spaces where all sorts of people found themselves confined together under harsh conditions. Outlaws and notorious criminals such as bank robbers, train thieves, and horse rustlers made up a significant portion of the prison population. These were individuals who often lived outside the law, challenging authority with gunfire and cunning. Some had gained legendary status, like Jesse James or Billy the Kid, becoming folk heroes to some and feared enemies to others. Their crimes were often violent and calculated, but their notoriety overshadowed many lesser-known convicts sharing the same cells. However, it wasn't just hardened criminals who were locked up. Drifters, wanderers, and even innocent settlers accused, rightly or wrongly, of crimes were thrown into the same prisons. In a place where legal representation was scarce and biased, wrongful arrests were common. Many were victims of mistaken identity, racial prejudice, or false accusations made by neighbors or rivals. These inmates had little chance to defend themselves and faced the same brutal conditions as the most dangerous criminals. Native Americans, displaced from their lands and often caught in conflicts with settlers or the U.S. government, were frequently imprisoned under harsh and discriminatory circumstances. They were sometimes accused of crimes based on cultural misunderstandings or outright prejudice, and their treatment in prisons was particularly cruel. Immigrants, especially those from Mexico, China, and Europe, also made up a sizable portion of the prison population. Facing language barriers and discrimination, they were vulnerable to unfair trials and harsher punishments. Their presence in these jails highlighted the ethnic and racial tensions simmering beneath the surface of frontier society. The mix of people in these prisons, criminal masterminds, innocents, minorities, and outsiders, created an unpredictable and dangerous environment. Rivalries, gang affiliations, and ethnic conflicts spilled over behind bars, often resulting in violence and unrest within the prison walls. This diversity underscored the broader social struggles of the Wild West itself, where survival was uncertain and justice was rarely blind. In the harsh reality of the Wild West, the justice system made little distinction when it came to incarcerating women and children. Although prisons were primarily designed to hold adult male offenders, women and even children found themselves behind bars under the same grim conditions, often without consideration for their specific needs or vulnerabilities. Women who were accused of crimes, ranging from theft and prostitution to more serious offenses like murder, were typically confined alongside male prisoners or in small, poorly segregated sections of the jail. These women endured the same brutal environments, overcrowded cells, inadequate food, and little protection from physical or sexual violence. Their presence in prisons challenged social norms of the time, yet there was little effort made to provide separate facilities or tailored care. The treatment of female prisoners was especially cruel, as they often faced neglect in medical care, hygiene, and basic safety. Some women were pregnant or nursing, adding another layer of suffering. There are documented cases of women giving birth in prison under deplorable conditions, without any assistance or support. Children, too, were not spared. The frontier justice system lacked juvenile courts or any formal recognition of childhood innocence. Young boys and girls accused of petty crimes or caught up in family disputes could be jailed alongside adults, exposed to violence and exploitation. These children were often orphans or runaways, vulnerable and with little hope for a better future. In some cases, entire families could be imprisoned together due to interrelated accusations or poverty-driven crimes. The lack of social services meant that the prisons became a catch-all for society's marginalized and desperate, trapping vulnerable women and children in a cycle of hardship and abuse. This indiscriminate incarceration reflected the Wild West's raw and often brutal approach to justice. Instead of rehabilitation or protection, prisons were places where women and children faced some of the harshest consequences of frontier life, often stripped of dignity and hope alongside their male counterparts. Despite their brutal conditions and many shortcomings, the prisons of the Wild West played a crucial role in shaping the modern American justice and penal systems. These early facilities were the first attempts to impose order and accountability in a region defined by lawlessness and chaos. While crude and often unjust, they laid the groundwork for a more structured, regulated approach to crime and punishment that would evolve in the decades to come. The experience gained from managing prisons in the Wild West highlighted the urgent need for better infrastructure, professional law enforcement, and codified legal processes. As towns grew and states were formed, legislators began to see the importance of building dedicated, well-designed correctional facilities with improved security measures. Lessons learned from escapes, riots, and poor living conditions influenced the design of future prisons, emphasizing safety, sanitation, and segregation of inmates. The harsh realities exposed the critical role of due process and fair trials. Over time, legal reforms introduced more protections for the accused, including rights to defense, evidence-based trials, and the establishment of juvenile courts. These reforms were partly a reaction against the vigilante justice and mob rule that had prevailed in frontier towns, signaling a shift towards the rule of law. Additionally, the Wild West prison experience underscored the need for prison reform, including the introduction of rehabilitation programs, medical care, and humane treatment of inmates. While such ideas were slow to take hold, they eventually became central to the philosophy behind modern corrections. Moreover, the Wild West prisons contributed to a cultural narrative that highlighted the tension between freedom and order, individualism and community responsibility. This legacy influenced how Americans viewed justice, punishment, and redemption, shaping public attitudes toward crime and incarceration even today. In sum, the Wild West prisons were rough beginnings, places of suffering and failure, but they also marked the first steps toward building a justice system capable of balancing the complexities of law enforcement with the rights and dignity of those it confined. The story of Wild West prisons is a reminder of a turbulent past where survival often meant facing brutal conditions, harsh judgments, and a justice system still in its infancy. These prisons, with all their flaws and failures, reflect the challenges of taming a wild frontier and the human cost of that transformation. Yet, from those rugged beginnings emerged the foundations of a more just and organized legal system, one that continues to evolve in pursuit of fairness and humanity. Understanding this history not only helps us appreciate how far we've come, but also urges us to remember the lessons of the past as we shape the future of justice.